a big thinker, and one of the original influencers in geek culture. The man behind Bruce, Peter, and Tony. I'm Tonya Hall for ZDNet and Tech Republic, and joining me is Bob Batchelor, historian and writer, visiting professor at Miami University, and author of Stan Lee, the man behind Marvel. Welcome, Bob.
Thanks for having me. It's a sad occasion to be here, but I'm happy to talk about Stan's amazing legacy and iconic status.
Give us a quick summary of your resume and what you're up to right now.
Well, I teach at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. I teach strategic communications, which I did many lifetimes ago in Silicon Valley and for other big companies and agencies. I've been teaching for a dozen or so years, and what I really do is teach to pay the bills and write to feed my soul. And so I like to write about big topics, big ideas. So this book on Stan Lee was kind of a natural because there aren't many people in the world who have touched more imaginations than Stan Lee. So Stan Lee, another example is I wrote a cultural history of the TV show Mad Men. I wrote a biography of Bob Dylan, a biography of the great Pennsylvania writer John Updike. So these are the kind of ideas that I like to tackle in my writing. So big cultural, pop culture, American culture kind of topics.
You mentioned the book. Obviously, while we're talking is unfortunate a time that we have to be talking about this, but Stan Lee, the man behind Marvel, is a biography about, I don't know, the 20th century, one of at least the 20th century's greatest storytellers. Why did you pick Stan Lee at the time that you did?
When my editor and I were looking around, we wanted to pick the biggest topic. And the biggest topic we could think of was Stan Lee, because the boom of the Marvel films has turned Marvel into a global juggernaut of epic proportions, the biggest movie glamour and glitz of all time, really. So when I started thinking about Stan Lee, it really meshed my early life, my influences, and then my current life so well. It was like getting hit by one of Thor's lightning bolts. It really meant everything to me. Stan is so important and such an important pop culture icon that it seemed like just the natural next step. No one had really written a full-scale biography of Stan up to the point where my book came out. So he was ripe for a biography. And in addition to all this, a lot of people don't know, but there's actually a Stan Lee archive. It's strangely housed at the University of Wyoming. And I could tell you that story later if you want. But you have to trip out to Laramie, Wyoming, where there's no Uber, there's very few hotels, there's almost no public transportation. But if you can get out there, there's this amazing place called the American Heritage Center. It's this fantastic museum. It looks like it should be in a space movie or something. It's a gigantic black triangle. It's a beautiful building. They house a wonderful archive, and Stan Lee's papers are there. So for somebody like me who wants to dig into the real nitty gritty, you get that kind of thing, the historical archive, plus you get to tell the story. So the big secret of this book, which I'll tell you because why not, is that it's researched like a professional historian, because that's what I am, but I wrote it for a general audience. And so it's filled with sociology, literary interpretation, history, cultural history, but I definitely wrote it for the fans out there who would tell me they love Stan Lee, but not really know much about him.
Speaking of research, what other surprises did you come across when you were researching for this book?
I think that what people might not know is that if Stan Lee didn't co-create these characters, create or co-create these amazing superheroes, he'd probably go down in history as one of the greatest magazine editors or certainly comic book editors, but one of the great editors of all time. What you find when you start digging into his life and the behind the scenes stuff is that he was responsible for every detail. And that's why we subtitled the book The Man Behind Marvel, because Stan was behind everything. When I was in Laramie, I found sketches for coloring books. And I remember that coloring book from when I was a kid. Those superhero comic books, he laid out the sketches for that he then had his artist team put together. So he was behind that kind of licensing stuff. He was editing most of the comic books. He approved all the covers. So he was more than just the traditional editor-in-chief. He was also art director. He would change covers if they weren't thrilling enough or didn't represent the characters. He was writing and rewriting. Of course, we know that. So the totality of this man's life, and that's just the Marvel part of it that was in the office. That's not even talking about, there's also invitations from colleges and universities around the world. In the 70s, late 60s and 70s, Stan was traveling to 2 or 3 colleges a week, just saying the Marvel and comic book story to anybody that would listen. And this is what really formed the Stan Lee that we would later see in the cameos and the movies and at comic conventions and that kind of thing.
He's had such an impact on geek culture. How much of his personality was woven into the characters?
That's a great question, and it's one I've been thinking a lot about since he passed away. I think that there were a couple key parts of Stan's personality that really wove their way into all of his characters. The first and foremost is probably a word that we use a lot today, but it's perfect for Stan. It's authenticity. He was an authentic person and deeply compassionate, and that deep compassion found its way in. And I think the easiest representation is Spider-Man, because Spider-Man is just a teenage kid. He's from Queens. You know, I've walked in the neighborhood that's Peter Parker is supposed to be from. But he was the first superhero to have real problems, real human life problems. And as a teenager, Stan's compassion and authenticity as a person really wove into the Spider-Man stories. You see the same kind of thing in the comic books. Tony Stark has a drinking problem, and so Iron Man has to deal with being a genius billionaire and a businessman and all those things, but also the personal problems. Stan was deeply compassionate, deeply humanitarian in his outlook in a way really that I think we could all draw from. If the American workplace had more Stan Lee-ism as kind of a thing, I think that the workplace would be a better place, because people would treat each other with much more respect and compassion and dignity than currently happens. That's the main piece of Stan. Probably the other piece is that he grew up in the Great Depression. I mean, he was from the mean streets of New York City. His family didn't have a lot of money. They had really no money a lot of the time. People from those areas, particularly successful artists and people in other industries, that stays with them forever. And so it constantly drove him. So he had this hard-charging work mentality. He always was working, and we saw that. He's working right up to the time of his death. And then also this deep compassion, which I think maybe those two things meld a little more than I'm able to describe right now. But I would say that those are probably the two that I see most frequently.
Many of Lee's characters and stories involved futuristic technology. What role did the technology play in Lee's stories, and did any of his imagined tech visions come true?
It's interesting. I was talking with a scholar who's in Australia, and he brought up the point that in many ways, Stan was the first person to really reach across the fourth wall and speak directly at his audiences through the comic books. And anybody who's read Stan Lee Marvel comic books, they're familiar with Stan's soapbox. He would not only talk about the future comic books that were coming available, but he was also talking about current events and politics. And he made, a really famous plea for better race relations in the comic books in the 70s. In a way, this was the kind of social media that existed in that era. So it's amazing to me that when you look back, Stan's ability to reach across and through that paper dimension, I can tell you for a fact, I grew up as a poor kid in Western Pennsylvania, and I felt like Stan Lee was my uncle in New York City. I had no idea what New York City was like when I was that young, but Stan and the comic books really created it for me. In terms of technology, I hate to let your listeners down too much, but Stan would be the first to admit he didn't know anything about technology. He was interested. He was really interested. He was really well read. His co-creators, Jack King Kirby and Steve Ditko, I would say that they're a little more well-read and a little more interested in the fantastic way that technology and life intersect. And so when you see the imagery from like some of the Fantastic Four, Avengers, early comics, that's from the mind of Jack Kirby with little tweaks here and there from Stan Lee. Stan was not a gizmo kind of guy, but he was a really big thinker. And so when you get Jack Kirby's art and Stan Lee's words together, it really created something pretty amazing. They were also very cognizant of the fact that they're creating these comic books at the height of the Cold War. And so you see in the early comics a lot of anti-Soviet or at least questioning of where this technology is leading us. And I think from the comic book fans that I talk to who are interested in technology, that influence of technology in the early comic books is something that they still really enjoy, even though a lot of it's kind of silly now. It's a little childish, but still fun and well drawn and well conceived.
Thank you so much, Bob, for putting these stories together. It's really fascinating. In fact, speaking of tech, you're working on a new book about an entrepreneur from a century ago. Care to give us a
Yes.
quick teaser?
Sure, I will. And this might be, other than the first announcement and some postings on Twitter and stuff, this is the first time I've actually talked about the book. Maybe one of America's greatest entrepreneurs. He just happened to be dealing in illegal bourbon during Prohibition. His name was George Remus. He was the biggest bootlegger. One journalist called him the J.D. Rockefeller of bourbon, and it was apt title for him. If you compare $1920 to today's money, he created in about 2.5 years, an empire that was about $2 to $5 billion. And he ran it all out of Cincinnati because Cincinnati is 300 miles, within 300-mile radius of Cincinnati is 80% of the bourbon in the world. And he knew how to get access to it, and he did a phenomenal job. So it's a really interesting entrepreneurial story. There's a lot of love triangles, and there's even murder and intrigue and jail and big famous names. So I'm not going to say too much more, but it's a book that people are going to enjoy. If you like bourbon history, it's going to be a treat.
I think if you like history in general, I think it's going to be fascinating. I'm looking forward to it, Bob. Bob Batchelor, historian and writer, visiting professor at Miami University, and author of Stan Lee, the man behind Marvel. Thanks again for joining. If somebody wants to pick up a copy of your book or connect with you, how can they do that, Bob?
I think the easiest way is to go to your local bookstore, wherever you like to buy books. Some people dig Amazon. Amazon's an easy couple clicks. It's on Barnes and Noble. If you email me and you want a signed copy, that's the best way to do that, unless you're traveling through Cincinnati and you can get to a local bookstore. I love talking to fans, and a lot of fans hit me up all the time. I love meeting people. I used to work in Silicon Valley, so I'm a big tech guy. I'm a big marketing PR guy. I love that stuff. I'm on Twitter at Cult Pop Culture. And Stan Lee, the man behind Marvel, has a Facebook page. I have a writer page. And then you can always find me at my web site, which is www.bobbatchelor.com. But I really dig the interaction with fans. And so I like to post a lot of pictures of my fans. And so I'm always available that way.
Thanks again, Bob. And if you guys want to find more of my interviews, you can do that right here on ZDNet or Tech Republic, or go to tonyahall.net. I've got links to all my social sites. Thanks for watching.